what I really see, what the common denominator is, this relentless pressure, this pressure to perform, whether it's performing in their craft or whether it's performing in a relationship or it's performing in school or performing at work. There's this relentless pressure to perform. And so to me, polyvagal theory provides us with this understanding and this framework of how we can relate to that pressure that we're actually feeling, and maybe in ways that we can begin to soften the edges around that, or maybe we can release some of that pressure in healthy ways, and maybe we can begin to navigate this world that is full of pressure and challenge and evaluation and competition and uncertainty and change in a way that is more aligned with a physiology that would be grounded in play versus physiology that's amped up, ready to fight, or one that's ready to run away, or that's has no resource left and is hiding.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Michael Allison as we take a communication perspective on polyvagal theory. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of our episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Michael Allison. Michael is the developer of the Play Zone, a unique application of polyvagal theory to optimize health, resilience, and performance. He's a contributing author for Psychology Today. Michael is an educational partner with the Polyvagal Institute, a Polyvagal Performance Consultant for high-profile organizations, executives, coaches, teams, athletes, and creatives, and he also provides a variety of courses and Polyvagal-informed certificate programs. So similarly to how I am steeped in CMM, Michael is very much steeped in polyvagal theory, which is what we're going to talk about today. This is the second conversation in our series about showing up. As I shared in our first conversation with Aminata, the question at the heart of these episodes is how are we showing up to each other? But also another good question to be asking along with that is how are we showing up to ourselves? And today we're going to explore both of these. And in our conversation today, Michael will provide some tools that are going to help us to think about how we think about these questions and hopefully offer us an ability to relate to them in a healthier way. So as I mentioned, Michael's approach is informed by polyvagal theory, which Michael will talk more about, but for some brief context, polyvagal theory was created by Dr. Stephen Porges, and the theory emphasizes the role the autonomic nervous system, especially the vagus nerve, plays in regulating our health and behavior. The Polyvagal Institute has a lot of great resources for diving deeper into this theory, so I've included links to their work in the show notes if you want to learn more after this conversation. Let's begin with Michael. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm looking forward to where we go, how it plays out.
Yeah, really looking forward to co-creating something meaningful in the time we have together today. To start, tell us about yourself. Who are you and how do you see yourself? And maybe start off with some stories. That's such a big part of what I do on this podcast. I'm talking about communication, is talking about stories. So I really like to center around that. If you can share some stories that help us understand a little bit about who you are.
Well, I am Michael Allison, and the reason I was introduced to you was based on polyvagal theory. And I found out about polyvagal theory maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it really helped encapsulate my entire history of growing up, navigating some tremendous challenges to my own body, my own physiology, and it helped to really articulate and explain what I was doing intuitively in order to heal, in order to grow. And at the time, too, I was owning and operating a fitness and wellness center here in Santa Barbara that I've had for 25 years that I actually just sold about 3 months ago.
Wow.
So in this really wonderful phase of life where I get to explore and really apply polyvagal theory into a lot of different disciplines and ways, and this freedom. And the word freedom to me is really when you're asking me kind of where I am in a story, what I'm actually trying to do in my life at this point is to apply the principles grounded in polyvagal theory and my unique application that I call the play zone, which we can talk more about, into freedom from the pressure. So what I experienced in my own life, and what I do a lot of work with high-level athletes or performers, often they're in college or professional. And what I really see, what the common denominator is, this relentless pressure, this pressure to perform, whether it's performing in their craft or whether it's performing in a relationship or it's performing in school or performing at work. There's this relentless pressure to perform. And so to me, polyvagal theory provides us with this understanding and this framework of how we can relate to that pressure that we're actually feeling, and maybe in ways that we can begin to soften the edges around that, or maybe we can release some of that pressure in healthy ways, and maybe we can begin to navigate this world that is full of pressure and challenge and evaluation and competition and uncertainty and change in a way that is more aligned with a physiology that would be grounded in play versus physiology that's amped up, ready to fight, or one that's ready to run away, or that's has no resource left and is hiding or withdrawing. And so that's my story of where I am today, as I'm on this quest really to share the concepts embedded in polyvagal theory in a way that actually makes sense and that are applicable into releasing this pressure and freeing up, this word freedom, and freeing up who we really are when we don't feel that pressure to have to be something, but who are we really? So that's where I am at this stage of life. And I think it's a wonderful gift, and it's exciting, and it weaves through all different ages and disciplines and all types of performers.
Yeah. Well, initially, wow, first of all, that's such a great start. And I already see so many similarities between the theory that you use, polyvagal theory, and the theory I use of CMM, in that there's this idea of what in the communication world we kind of refer to as like pluralistic truths, or just that multiple stories can coexist at the same time. And another really key part of my theory, not my theory, but the theory I use is this element of choice and personal choice, and kind of what story do you want to tell and what meaning do you want to make? And I hear that immediately in what you're saying, that yes, this pressure exists, and that might not change. You might not be in control of your context or your environment or your circumstances, but what's the meaning that you're making out of? How are you reacting to it? And also what I'm hearing you say is working toward this end goal, or towards this hope of, when you're talking about freedom, I talk about this way of being that's maybe more authentic. And that's kind of what the working towards. Exactly.
Let's you said a lot in there. So let me unpack it in a way that will help explain what polyvagal theory is sort of all about.
Perfect.
From the polyvagal perspective, the stories that we tell ourselves, or the meaning that we give an experience, or the emotion that we have in that interaction or in that situation, from a polyvagal perspective, that is emerging out of the physiological platform, the state that we're in. So the brainstem and these very primitive networks are surveying the scene, right? Reading all of the cues internally, externally, and relationally, and making very interpretive, reflexive, beneath conscious awareness shifts that trigger a change in the internal environment. So an example, we haven't met before. and we don't know each other. So it would be very natural in this to, oh, I'm uncertain, and we're trying to read each other's cues, right? And if I showed up and I was distracted and looking away, or I had a really deep, powerful voice and I was really loud, and right, those would send signals to your nervous system, to your brainstem, and that would be interpreted reflexively as, oh, maybe a little uncertain, or maybe that's a warning sign, or whatever it is. That then would change your physiology. It would change your internal environment. And then out of that might emerge a story of, what's wrong with him? Or what did I say? What did I do something wrong? Right. So these stories emerge out of these physiological shifts in relation to the context, in relation to the environment. And that's how emotions play into it too. So we have these shifts in our physiology, and that information percolates up into higher levels of the brain. And then on the context and the interaction in the situation, we now have an emotion and a meaning that we've given to this cluster of bodily feelings. And that can now feed back into even a more intense bodily response. Or what you were saying, that choice, we can notice this playing out, and we may have an opportunity now to interrupt that meaning that would feed back into more of a dysregulated body. And give ourselves agency into scripting a new narrative and changing the physiology. So they're very much entwined.
Yeah. And I see that my experience, and I've said this in so many podcasts, people will be tired of hearing me say it, but it comes up in like every conversation I have that's relevant, to say that my experience when I first learned about CMM, when I was first learning about any number of communication theories, there's a lot of really valuable ones out there. The experience was more of like a recognition than like, oh, I've just been told something entirely new.
Totally.
It was, oh, I have experience. The only difference now is I have words for it.
Yes.
I imagine that's the same experience with polyvagal, where a lot of people can say, oh, recognition immediately. I've been feeling this in my body the whole time, but I haven't known how to speak the language of my body really until you've given me these words, and then I can articulate what's going on.
That's right. It aligns with our own experience. It aligns with our own intuition. It just simply makes sense. And exactly what you said. And that's how it was for me when I started reading about the theory. It was like, oh yes, obviously. Right. And that to me then was also, it was so obvious to me that this isn't just a recipe for healing. It's a recipe for well-being. Right. And it's a recipe for, in the world of performance, optimizing your performance, whether it's on the stage, at the workplace, whatever it is, because in order for us to actually, the way I'm articulating polyvagal theory or applying it, is that the intervening variable between my potential and my performance is not how hard I try. It's that physiological state. It's how safe and comfortable and connected my body feels in that moment when I'm trying to pull from my potential, when I'm trying to pull out my skill set or my knowledge, or when I'm trying to interact in a way that actually aligns with my heartfelt intentions. What it allows me to actually do that is if I'm grounded in a physiology that feels safe enough, that feels resourced enough. So that feeling is really representing how the autonomic nervous system is regulating the physiology, whether it's supporting our health and growth and recovery, or whether it's interrupting that to defend, to protect, to attack, or to hunker down. So to me, it just gives us such agency to go with that choice. It ties directly into what you were saying.
Yeah, I love this. And I want to pause before I get too ahead of myself. Could you give us a little definition? Just, I don't want to, go over people's heads if they're not familiar with the theory already. What is your kind of, to someone who's never heard about it before, how do you explain polyvagal theory?
So first off, let's just give credit to Dr. Stephen Porges, who is an amazing man and brilliant, but also he lives and breathes this. I know him very, very well, and he is an embodiment of the theory. So I just want to acknowledge that, because he really does live and walk the talk. It's beautiful. So we already touched on a really big component of it, and that is that how our physiology, well, let me step back, how we feel or how we don't feel. A lot of us live in bodies that are numb.
Yeah.
Okay. So how we feel or don't feel is reflecting something deeper. And it's reflecting how the physiology is being regulated autonomically, beneath conscious control, beneath conscious awareness. Okay. So that's the first part, is how we feel actually reflects how the internal environment is being regulated by our nervous system. Now, why is that important? Because how that internal environment is being regulated, which now equals how we feel or don't feel, that influences essentially every aspect of how we experience the world, how we act, how we react, how we interact, what we think, the emotions we experience, and ultimately the behaviors that play out or the habits that we're drawn to. So that's the first key part, is that polyvagal theory explains the neurophysiology and the neuroanatomy specifically into the two branches of the vagus nerve and how they've changed through evolution and where they tie into the brainstem, and how all of that interplays more simplistically to say how that internal environment is being autonomically regulated influences how we perceive ourselves to be in this world. That's really important. So to me, that gives us an opportunity not only for choice, like we've talked about, it also softens the edges around guilt and blame and shame, self-criticism, or even criticism of other and judgment of other and evaluation when someone's behaviors aren't matching what we would hope their intentions are, right? So we can look beneath behaviors and look beneath our own and what others are doing and see deeper into, are they in a physiological state that has enough resource and is actually being regulated? Or are they in a state of defense, a state of threat? And now they're behaving in ways for self-survival. So that is foundational to the theory. The other key part of the theory is that, different than our reptilian ancestors and most other non-mammalian species, we as social mammals have this gift that we can see, hear, and feel cues coming from each other and from our pets, right?
Yeah.
Of warmth and welcome and safety and connection. And that ability to see, hear, and feel, that has a direct impact on that internal environment. It actually links in the brainstem so that we can immediately, through social support and trusting and playful relationships, we can quickly shift into a state that feels more grounded, feels more okay. And then we can share that with others. So we can get into this reciprocal, synchronous, interactive relationship that feeds our nervous system, feeds our body with more and more safety and certainty and connection, and ultimately a sense of belonging, which is what we all need to feel in order to thrive in this world. So polyvagal theory, to me, articulates this physiological state, how that's being regulated by the vagal nerve, and how that creates this feedback loop. But that gets really complex. But it's just knowing our physiological state, our internal environment influences how we experience the world. And then we also, in addition to responding to uncertainty and threat, we have this unique capacity as social mammals to respond to features and cues coming back and forth of safety and connection through our facial expressions, through the tone of our voice, how we're breathing, our postures, our gestures, our body language, and how powerful that is, because it's turning on the neural mechanisms that actually simultaneously change the neural mechanisms and the neural regulation of our heart and our breathing and our overall internal environment. So those are the key pieces.
Yeah, that's a really helpful place to start. One question I still have is that, so what's at the core of this theory is this kind of automatic subconscious process that's going on in our bodies that's maybe the part that we don't necessarily control. So knowing that that's at the core of the theory is I don't know if you'd call it the purpose of the theory, or kind of like, okay, well, where do we go from here? Is that, okay, once you have this knowledge, this language, an understanding around what is happening during that part that you can't control, then that sets you up to react to the things that are already going on in your body and get back to that choice that we're talking about. So it's kind of like, once you understand what's happening in this part that you can't control, then you can focus on the other things that you can control.
Both. So the way I frame it is acknowledge and respect and recognize that this is playing out. Whether we notice it or not, whether we like it or not, we are having these reflexive shifts, changes in our internal environment based on our nervous system's subconscious interpretation of the signals coming at us and between us and already internally, what's going on internally. So now respect and recognize that. And simply you can say, meet our body where it is. Or what I like to say too is align with our physiology. So let's just recognize that. Let's just be with that. Let's not try to change it. Let's not try to make it stop happening. Let's not try to pretend it's not happening. Right? So now we have this moment. This is happening. How can I align with that internal environment in a way that might realign my physiology to support my intentions? So what do I mean by that? So I step into this conversation and I notice that my heart's beating a little faster, or my breathing is a little more rapid. And if I started to speak, I notice that the tone of my voice is different than I would like. It's not broadcasting as much warmth and welcome. So in that moment, those are all reflective cues that my physiology in this experience, for whatever reason, is slightly off of where it might normally be when I feel my safest. So in that experience, now I have a moment to relate to that and go, okay, well, maybe I can just slow down my words and say a few more words before I take my next inhale, because I know that a longer exhale will begin to slow my heart rate. Okay.
Yeah.
Or maybe I really look at your smile like you just did, and I really pay attention to that, and I allow my nervous system to absorb that cue of connection. Right. Or maybe I just feel my feet on the ground, or I feel myself sitting, and I help myself orient to what also is true, is that I actually am totally safe. Right. So that to me is what polyvagal gives us. It gives us that moment, not only of choice of a new story, but actually a way of relating to what is playing out, whether we pay attention to it or not, in ways that might help us better align our physiology to our goal in that moment, or to our values.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's starting to align with one way that I understand CMM, or some language that's been used beyond outside of what I've done around CMM, is to talk about it as offering us a perspective, offering us a set of practice, and offering us a goal. And I'm starting to see some of that in maybe how you use polyvagal specifically, in that I know you talked about using the language of being like polyvagal informed. And I'm curious to hear what that means. Or you even reference, a polyvagal perspective. I talk about using a communication perspective. And to me, I could go on and on about what that means, about the centering of the stories and the meaning and just all of this. And then where my podcast comes in, and my hope is in this set of practices to say, okay, how do we take CMM parallel to the story I'm hearing from you? How do you take polyvagal from a theory to an actual practice that's not just this thing that exists in academia for people to hypothesize on and talk about, but how do we get it into our real actual lives, to the real actual people who, in my case, I think about the people that are doing the communicating, that are in the relationships, that are running the organizations, and in all these relationships and doing all this communicating that matters. How do you give it to them in a way that's accessible so it can be used, so it can turn into a practice And then for us, that goal at the end, the language that we use in CMM is talking about a better social world, which, you could define in many different ways. But if you can come up with a definition for a better social world and have something to work towards, then you can kind of step back and say, okay, how do I get there? So I'm curious what you would maybe put into words about the practice. Yeah.
Better social world, from my perspective, is that we move into relationships in a state that we are accessible, that we are actually feel safe enough to now exchange cues back and forth of connection and appreciation and understanding and authenticity. You said that word before too, and that's a beautiful word. Authenticity to me is when our intentions are actually aligned with our physiology. So we could be authentically angry. That's authentic if, right, we're expressing, but we can also be authentically loving and authentically kind. But that requires that our physiology in that moment, when we're expressing words of kindness or gratitude, that we actually are in that physiology that supports that. That to me is authentic.
Yeah.
Whereas when someone is saying all the right things, but we don't have a visceral feeling of connection, that's telling me that they weren't matched, right? And that's what makes a great actor. A great actor is actually in the physiological state of the character. And we can feel it and we know it because we also get into that state. We move into that. And that's when they're, quote, not a great acting experience. It's that they weren't dropped fully into that physiological state from which their role was being cast.
Yeah.
Right. So that's that part. So to me, this enhancing this social container, I call it a container of safety and connection.
Yeah.
This container of safety and connection requires each of us to come into meeting our own bodies and then respecting the other bodies, the other nervous systems in the room, without judgment, without evaluation, and doing what we can to exchange as much warmth and welcome to every body in that container, right? So that's one part of what you asked.
Yeah.
And what are the real practical parts to all of this? Well, you can have daily practices of like breath work. You can have, and that's great, where you deliberately modify your cadence or the length of your inhale in regards to your exhale to deliberately move heart rate patterns and change breathing, which will change your physiological state. You can do different types of voice work and inflections. You can sing, you can hum, you can do all of these different daily practices, which what they're doing, the way I see it, is we're actually trying to create a sense of agency where you have some control of your physiology. So you know a way of relating to it when it shifts. We're also building physiological resilience. We're building this internal capability for the physiology to trust and to know that it can move through different states and not get locked into any one state. So that's what practices are for. But you can also just do this in everyday life, right? Like you can simply check in with yourself and meet your body where it is. How am I breathing right now? Can you feel your heart rate? Like I can feel my heart rate. Not everyone can, but can I check in and feel my heart rate? Oh, what's it like? I can feel muscle tension. Or if we're talking, I can just become aware of what is the tone of my voice? What is the speed of my voice? How tight is my jaw? Or what is the tension around my eyes? Because all of those nerves that regulate the muscles in our face, neck, and head, they tie into the brainstem and are interconnected to that vagal regulation of our physiology. So the third part, which we already sort of talked about, is how social cues can become cues of safety and connection, which change our physiology. The reason that's occurring is because of this interconnection between the nerves that regulate our voice, our ability to listen, the middle ear muscles to extract human voice from background sound, and our facial expressions, particularly around the eyes. Those nerves that enable us to change all of those features in order to communicate, connect to the vagal regulation of the heart, the lungs, and the overall physiology. So there's this face-heart connection. And that's a beautiful piece. So
Yeah.
I'll give you a story that will also tie in to kind of this. So, and this just happened yesterday. So my wife and I are sitting on the sofa. We've been married for 25 years. Okay. And we both just have been reading this book, Quiet, by Susan Cain. It's about 10 years old. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's a beautiful book. And it's really contrasting how our society values extroverts and sort of looks at introverts as just not as great leaders as extroverts, making the argument that actually there can be amazing leaders.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a lot of variables in what's going on with an introvert next. So we were having this conversation and we were reflecting back to early on in our marriage. And my wife would always drag me to parties. And she always wanted to go to all these parties. And I'm like, do you remember what I would do? And she's like, yeah, you'd be locked on my side the whole time. You'd be like right next to me the whole time. And I'm like, yeah, and what would you do? She'd be like, I'd get annoyed and I'd be like, leave me alone. And then she'd go off and do, right. And she'd be over socialized. And then I'd say, well, what would I do next? She's like, well, then I'd often find you outside sitting like on a sofa or sitting outside somewhere by yourself. Or maybe you'd be against the wall somewhere having a conversation with one other person, but you were never, right? And I'm like, yeah, do you understand? Because now she's been around me enough to understand polyvagal. I'm like, do you understand why? What was happening? Yes, right? Like, so there's an example of looking back 25 years, coming into that environment where it's a strange environment. And I didn't often know most of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have any familiar faces. There's a lot of noise. People are drinking and socializing. It's really loud. And there's just a lot of, from the subconscious surveillance system's perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unfamiliarity, unpredictability, a lot of background sound. And for my nervous system in that stage of my life, that was overwhelming. And so what did I do? I naturally wanted to stay with my partner, with something that my nervous system knew I could trust and could support me in that. And then when she would move herself away,
right,
I just found myself walking outside. And at the time, I wasn't aware of polyvagal theory. I was absolutely aware of how my body was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I removed myself, which is one part of the equation, right? We can remove ourselves from those environments that are bombarding us, that are beginning to overwhelm our capacity to be in that space. Or knowing what I know now, I don't have that experience, but even if I did, I could now use that as an exercise. I could actually go into that experience, feel and just be with the bodily responses that are reflexively occurring. And then I could try to use some of my tools. I could say, okay, can I take a really long exhale now? And what does that do? Does that slow me down? Does that make me feel, oh, no, not really. Oh, can I actually now just kind of scan the room and look for a smiling, welcoming face? Oh, that's cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Or can I do whatever, right? Like, can I actually hear the music that's playing? Can I look at, oh, there's a beautiful plant. Oh, look at that. So I can use what I call the habit of safety, which is a practice.
Yeah.
Day to day, moment to moment, wherever I go, I can find and feel and see and hear whatever is welcoming and reassuring and maybe calming to my physiology, to my nervous system, right? So I can look for those faces. I can look for parts in nature that I love. And if there's nothing available, I can use my imagination. I can bring in that perspective that you were talking about, right? I can pan out and look at it as, wow, this is a really cool neural exercise. Let's see how my body does. So there's all those different resources that I call the habit of safety. And all that means is wherever I go, wherever I am, I find, I feel, and absorb what is available to me that reassures my body, reassures with those really primitive survival networks that life is okay, that I'm actually all right. So that's another way So instead of setting up deliberate practices, everything in life is a practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great story. And what I'm hearing using my communication practice, my communication perspective to hear that story through is that, again, that value of what, just the value that's added, the way that the social world is transformed when you have the language offered through polyvagal theory, through a book like Quiet, to be able to say to your partner, to anyone in your life, this is what I experienced. This is what things mean to me. This is the story that I live. When you can communicate that to someone else, then I just think that is so amazingly helpful, because again, like that imagination can be such a great tool, and it can also maybe hold us back if we're not offering curiosity to other people or giving people the chance, or if we don't have the tools or the practice to say, what does that mean to you? Can you tell me what that means to you? Because I think we're experiencing it differently. And if you don't have that, then you're left to maybe that keeps us divided, keeps this, kind of polarization, or keeps it like us versus them, or it just highlights the differences. Well, I was going to say it highlights the differences more than the similarities, but that's not even it. It's that the differences exist in both situations, but how comfortable are you? How confident are you navigating those? And that takes me back to this idea, this concept of dialogue within a communication perspective being, distinctly different than just, talking about, oh, we're talking or we're in conversation, but to truly be in dialogue, meaning I am profoundly open to you and your ways of being and what you have to say and what stories you have lived. And at the same time, I hold firm in my own ways of being and what I know to be true for me. And there's peace in that, because both can exist at the same time. And again, that curiosity is really, I think, what's at the core of it, rather than any kind of like defensiveness, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add to that polyvagal theory would say that in order to have that capacity, there has to be just enough safety in the body, just enough
safety,
presence, just enough functionally, just enough of this ventral vagal slowing the heart rate, just enough containing the breathing, just enough maintaining that internal environment, just enough that you're not in an all-out fight or an all-out defensive physiology. Because once that gets going, then it's almost off the table for being able to have choice or being able to have that dialogue. So that's why it's also helpful, because there are going to still be those moments. We are human, right? So that both for ourselves and our partners or any relationship, when that occurs, because it will, maybe in that moment, as the one who might be losing it, we can still see and hear what's actually happening and feel that maybe we can interrupt ourselves before we say something that's really hurtful. Right? Or if it happens the other way around, we can not necessarily say, oh, that was their intention and they're flawed in their character. And we can say, wow, they were really losing it on the inside. Like their physiology and their nervous system thought this was really, really dangerous. And it was doing everything it could to protect. Right. So to me, it helps soften that around both ourselves and others.
Yeah. The softening is a great way to put like more empathetic way, more compassionate way of being in relationship with people. It's cool because what I initially came into this conversation feeling like I had the good grasp on is that with polyvagal theory, you can understand it in yourself. And again, you mentioned all these practices that you can do for yourself, but then there is this other side of it that you can be aware in the relational space. How am I showing up and what signals am I giving to other people for their own physiological experiences? How am I shaping them?
That is what Steve Porges would say is being polyvagal informed.
Okay, yeah.
You brought up that phrase. When you're polyvagal informed, it means that you recognize in yourself how your own physiological states impact how you act, react, and interact, and you recognize that in others. Right? And so when we're in any relationship, we do our own part of helping align with our physiology in a way that we show up how we would really want to show up. And then we appreciate and respect the other's bodily reactions in the state that they're in. Right. And then And we navigate that together as best we can, and so to me, that's what being polyvagal informed is. And
Yeah.
then we can start to, I think another key thing to talk about here, which would be interesting, I don't know where it'll go, but to me, that's what healing. So healing or growth
Mm-hmm.
or expanding our resilience or our capacity to perform, and I mean perform outside of just on stage, I mean in life, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever, back to that pressure to perform. The way that we help increase our capacity for that in the face of more and more challenge combines what you were talking about and what I've been talking about. It combines the two pieces, the story and the state. It combines the meaning and the physiology. So what we do is we can do it in those interactions, or we can do it in interactions that just create the physiological states that would occur in that interaction. Okay. So an example, someone who does public speaking and they go and they stand up on stage and they get up on stage and they can't use their voice.
Mm-hmm.
It's all squeaky, or their hands are just perspiring and they're swallowing, and there's just so much going on. And then what happens is they have a memory of that experience. And so now the next time they go on stage, even before they get on, in anticipation,
Mm-hmm.
their body starts preparing for that mobilizing, because I'm now being observed by all these people. And now I also have an association from a prior experience. And so now it gets even amped up more. And so you can see a trajectory moving in one direction where a physiology and the narrative becomes, I can't public speak, or I'm never going to do this again. Right. Or you can now have a different experience where, okay, that's what happened. So now I'm going to actually simulate that same physiology. I might do it in a cold shower. I might do it in some other environment. I might go karaoke. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
All what I'm getting at is you can get the physiology moving in the same direction that it was in that public speaking environment, and begin to help the body be able to move in and out of that, and then come back to calm and ease, and in and out and in and out. So you're building this physiological flexibility, which is what resilience is. And it doesn't even have to be in that same context. And then as you build that capacity, then you start bringing it into simulations that are closer and closer to that context. But now you have resource.
Yeah.
And now you have a physiology that actually trusts that it can move through these different states, which in real life means I can feel unsafe, and then I can feel safe, and then I can feel unsafe and safe and unsafe and safe. And I can move in and out. And that to me is the progression. So healing to me, or growth, or optimizing performance is metaphorically, it's trusting that it's safe to feel.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's trusting that it's safe to feel safe. Then it's trusting that it's safe to feel safe in connection with another. And then it's trusting that it's safe to feel unsafe, then safe again, then unsafe, then safe again. And basically to feel whatever it is we're feeling. Because we trust that whatever it is we're feeling, which means whatever our physiology is experiencing, we can be with, and we can navigate back into enough safety at some point.
Bringing up public speaking is interesting. And so, yeah, I'm excited to build on this and I want to share a story. And I'm curious what, your kind of polyvagal perspective will be on this story of my own experience. Is that, well, I, first of all, for context, would say that I'm not someone that has always known how to, like, the language I would use at least is to speak the language of my body, or to be really in tune with what was going on with me physiologically, and to listen to my body, take that as any kind of sign or direction. I think I had like a very much a value around like intellect. And I like that I know what feelings I was feeling or what I was thinking. And I could articulate that well. And that meant a lot to me to be able to do that. I couldn't necessarily articulate how I was feeling physically. There was a disconnect there. I did competitive speaking. Like, I was on the speech team all through high school and college, and I loved it. And I was so anxious every single time. It was great. And I had such a great experience. My physical experience, every single time I would get up to give a speech, just like wrecked insides. And now that I'm not doing that anymore, I look back and it's amazing to me how much I put my body through for 7 years doing this activity. Again, complicated because, again, it was very meaningful for me and an enjoyable experience. But there was that anxiousness around public speaking, which is, I know, such a big thing for a lot of people. And for me, my own experience, I think back to, it was like sophomore year that I joined the team, sophomore year of high school. And I couldn't tell you what possessed me to join the team, because I had not exhibited any kind of inclination toward public speaking before. I was very quiet. But then I think I kind of like found success with it. And so that encouraged me onward. And that was kind of the motivation to maybe kind of like power through this. Like, okay, my physical experience of this is not fun. I like wouldn't eat during those days. Honestly, like feel very kind of like unwell. But because my focus and where I lived was in my mental, in my head, it was like, okay, we're just going to like willpower through this. And so I'm curious, like, again, that feels like I would have had an entirely different experience if I had understood something like polyvagal theory. So I'm curious, like hearing that, what that makes you think of through your polyvagal lens.
It makes me think of a lot. And the first thing is that experience that you were describing is very common in high level performers of any kind, whether it's in business, whether it's in sport, whether it's performing on stage, is they have that same visceral feeling and they grind through it and they push until they can't. Yeah. Right. Until they can't. I've been studying this swimmer recently, and that he's world class. And that was his exact experience. He would go and he was winning all of these gold medals, the Tokyo Olympics, all of these different things. And then he's in the world championships and he's winning. He won 2 golds and now he's into his main event, and he scratches and leaves and disappears from the sport of swimming for a year because he finally crested that point where his body said, no more, no mas. I can't, because he was doing what you were just describing. So I think you're describing a very common pathway, which is where we started. Yeah. That pressure. Yes. That relentless pressure. And so you were putting your body in that state of relentless pressure, but it sounds like it was only during those competitive moments of giving public speaking. Yeah, it was very like concentrated. Yeah. Right. And so for you, and I don't know how you were outside of that and in your life, but it almost sounds like that was when you would actually feel your body, even though it wasn't a good feeling. Yeah. It was actually a chance to feel and not just be in the head. Yeah. But what it did is, because it didn't feel so good, it actually locked you even more focused in your head, which was where you like to be. So in a way, it was creating the same experience of even more focus. Yeah. Don't be distracted by this. Be in here. Right. But at the same time, it was actually giving you a sense of feeling your body, which we're meant to. We're wired to have this connection. It gets interrupted by our culture, by our prior experiences, by all kinds of things that can disrupt it because it's uncomfortable. So to me, that was a chance for you to feel, but then to come out of that and channel and get really intense and focused, which is where you really like to be. And it was maybe a chance to feel alive afterwards, right? Or you really felt alive and you felt like you overcame something, and there's reward in that. So now you have dopamine being released and you have all of that chemically going on as well as the neural part. Yeah. So that part makes sense. But I think really what you're sharing is a really good thing to sort of talk about, because it's what I see all the time with the people I work with and try to help, right? Is that they have been doing what you're talking about. Whatever it is, they're like a baseball pitcher that I work with, world class, got to a place and the mound used to be his safe spot. Right? This swimmer that I was talking about, the swimming pool, when he was a kid, that was his safe spot. But little by little over time, that actually became not safe because he had this level of expectation, this level of evaluation, this competition to even keep my spot on the mound or in the pool, right? And everybody watching, everybody looking at every little thing I do. And from the nervous system's perspective, that's not safe. That's not a welcoming environment.
Yeah.
All right. So little by little, both of their physiologies were becoming more and more unsafe in their quote safe place. And they did what you were doing. They just locked in. They just kept getting more focused and working harder and doing more things that would quote help them perform, tweaking mechanics, preparing more, training harder, getting faster, stronger. And none of that is actually meeting the body where it is.
Yeah.
So eventually, poof, the body says, I'm done. Like the body will keep speaking louder and louder. Yeah. And you'll either get a big injury, you'll get really, really sick, you'll burn out. It will eventually get to the point where now the narrative will make sense of a body that is actually moving into a shutdown response. Which is another piece of polyvagal theory that we didn't talk about, is that there is a predictable pattern to the pressure. So at first, we will mobilize when things are unsafe, or when we interpret reflexively that the environment is unsafe. We will begin to mobilize resources, and that is that sympathetic fight or flight response that we hear a lot about, right? But if that challenge is relentless, or that challenge is overwhelming in the moment, or we exhaust all of our resources to stay mobilized, the body will shut down in one form or another, meaning it'll withdraw, we will dissociate, we won't feel anymore, right? Or it'll be a full collapse. And that's what we see play out too. And we can see that play out, which is why I developed the play zone. Yeah. We can see that play out in a matter of minutes, or we can see that play out over a season or over a career or a lifetime of different athletes. It's very evident. And I did a lot of studying of tennis, because tennis is they're right there, one against the other, competition. Everybody's watching, evaluation. And you will change the conditions, the weather, the balls, everything is changing. They are metaphorically the culture that we live in. And when we watch them, we can see these behaviors, which we think are intentional. And we look at it through this lens, and we see it just playing out of these physiological states that are losing more and more safety and connection until they're giving up and getting off the court, or they're smashing rackets, or so we can just watch it play out.
That is helpful to hear you say all that, and so interesting to me, because I like my examples niche. You're talking about, pro athletes. Maybe people are like, well, that's not me, but I think it is so normalized in our culture. That's what I can speak to. I'm sure many other places around the world too. People just like exist in a state of stress, and again, because they don't know how to speak the language of their body, or because we do kind of have this. I'm kind of relating it back to even this, like, gotta pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you gotta be self-sufficient. We have such a value around that it makes us just steamroll how we feel, just ignore it, put it out of our head. Like you said, what I was doing and what many other people have done is like, you can trick yourself for a time into thinking that you're performing and you're at the peak of your performance, because you are steamrolling what your body's telling you. You're ignoring what your body's telling you because you don't know how to interpret it. And then that will come to an end. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but what your work with the play zone is to say what you've been doing that you think is you performing at the top of your game is actually slowly destroying you. Here's what it looks like to truly perform in a way that is aligned and embodied with your physiology and your psychology.
Yeah, I'll say it a little more gently.
Sure.
But I'm thinking what you're saying, in that there's a much more sustainable way.
Yes.
And actually, you're still not even playing to your potential when you're in fight. When when it's all about dominating and showing the world that you are something. Yeah. That means you're not in a physiology that actually can support play. And the physiology that supports play, that it supports actually seeing this opportunity and the opponent as a collaborator in lifting your potential.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a different physiology. And you can get there. It doesn't have to be a war. It doesn't have to be, right? We've been conditioned to believe that.
Yeah.
And we're in these bodies that are pushed so hard that a lot of these bodies, because the training is so vigorous, they can't feel, because if they felt, they wouldn't push through. So in a way, we train out the feeling.
Yeah.
And so that's why I say I do it more gently,
Yes.
because we can't throw everything out because they believe they got to where they are because of that.
Yeah.
Grit in that discipline. What I'm saying is there's another metric and there's another way to optimize your resilience. And it's not just grit and determination. They're great. They're great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the same time, they override meeting your body where it is at times. And they aren't necessarily the pathway into getting the physiology into a state that supports free play, that supports you freeing up versus being a little bit guarded, being a little offended, right? And that's a different physiology. So that's what the play zone is. That is what I love to teach. But the bigger picture is just what we're talking about, is it's not sport dependent. It isn't that. It's life. Yeah. And it's way bigger. And often when I work with male athletes, the first several months, it's talking about their sport, but not much longer. It goes into relationships. It's always about relationships, relationship with their coach, relationship with their teammates, relationship with someone they're dating, hanging. It comes into that because that's what we are. We are social mammals. And so this, for me, is the safe gateway in through those old paradigms to actually now start talking about what you were talking about, this social, creating these social containers that are actually acknowledging each other's reactions, their own physiological reactions, and finding ways to navigate that and show up authentic and accessible. So that's what it's really all about. Yeah. Without ever talking about it, it just goes into that.
So for people who are, let's say, not a professional athlete, what are you really getting at? What's at the core of you talking about play as the center of your work, as opposed to being in what's most recognizable to me as an alternative is maybe that like fight or flight stress response? Yeah.
Play means that you're actually in a physiology that feels safe enough, connected enough, and appreciates whatever it is you're in, what you're doing. It's not about, I have to beat you, I have to overwhelm you. You're still playing to win in a sport. That's okay. But it doesn't mean that you're grounded in a physiology that doesn't have enough, that is fearful, that is some reactive mode. So play is certainly at the heart of where I'm coming from. And we can turn competition into play, into technically co-regulation, where we're actually lifting each other. We can turn competition into collaboration, right? In the workplace. Same kind of thing. But again, what's underneath that is two physiological states actually coming into enough connection and safety that now from that can emerge creativity and collaboration and play. Yeah. So that's how I look at it. And it's recognizing why, and those people who have become, quote, successful by fighting, by being really aggressive, it's recognizing when that doesn't work. It's also recognizing, was that really when you're at your best? Almost every time I ask someone, when you've been at your best, does it feel like you're fighting? I have yet to hear it. Yeah. I have yet to hear someone say, yeah, I was totally just, I have yet to hear it. What I hear is, no, I was actually enjoying it and I was relaxed. Yeah. And it was like, I was like doing stuff I didn't even know I could do. And I was just, well, that's a different state. That isn't a state that's grounded in fear. That's actually a state that's freeing up. And we can help try to explore that. So that to me is your optimal state. And let's see if we can find that. And then let's expand that out. So where now you're moving through the world because it's really a physiological state.
Yeah.
So to me, the play zone is way broader than sport or performance, but it really is a way to relate to that relentless pressure that where we started, where I think we are all facing, where for whatever reason, there's so many reasons why we would feel a pressure to have to perform in all of our various roles in order to make it in this world. Right. And so
honestly, play feels so revolutionary because of this, like obsession of the hustle culture, the grind culture. Yeah. Just how we've measured success traditionally. Feels so subversive.
And you said one other thing that was really, that I think we should flag. And you said how much the culture is focused on self-sufficiency, self-resourcing. And the way that we're talking about play is not self. Play requires another.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really metaphorically, why I like to work with teams is what we all want in life is to feel like we are part of a team.
Yeah.
That is in our biology. And that being part of a team means that if I need a break and I need to sit on the bench, I know that you can play for me, right? I know that if I come up short, I can come over, sit on the bench, and you put your arm around me, and I know we're all okay.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's what we want in our biology, is to be a part of a team. And then teams can play, and you can play amongst each other. I was just right before you and I got on, I was just consulting with a Division I girls volleyball program. And I was just over at the university. And that was, we were playing games. We were playing with VR devices and doing all these simulations and things of how their bodies respond to, like one was being on a plank on an elevator. So you're 60 stories up. How's your body responding? Oh, let's try, it's responding like that. Let's just have your teammate who you can't see, but she can talk to you. And now how does your body respond? So letting them understand and to actually feel powerful cues of support from a trusted teammate can shift immediately that physiological response that's playing out under pressure. You know, this was on a plank, 60 stories up, but it's the same thing on the court. You walk out onto the court, physiology is having that response. You can look at your teammate and you guys can reassure each other and you can actually feel how the body can shift. And that's what's playing out in everyday life, right? And that's why it isn't about self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
It's about actually finding trusted others. And then over time, for some of us, the trusted other that we once had was where we were hurt. So we're no longer in bodies that actually trust that it's safe to trust. So we have to slowly get there.
Yeah.
And build that trust. But that is our ultimate gift that Polyvagal Theory articulates, is that we're meant to feel safe, but we're really meant to feel safe with others.
Right.
And that's the quest, is this enduring to feel safe and to feel safe with others.
That's, taking me back to us talking earlier about, this kind of second part of like, yes, once you have this language for yourself and you can do these practices for yourself, but then this follow-up of how are you showing up in your relationships. And something I talk about is, we talk about the stories that we tell and the way that they shape us, but also the stories that have not been told, the stories we haven't heard, that shapes us too, not to hear them. And the fix is not as simple as, well, those people with those stories should just speak up. Because again, if they don't feel safe to do so in the context, so I just think it matters so much that, I talk about communication, but it's not just what you say or the person talking, you're the one doing the communicating. It is everybody is in the act of communicating in all the nonverbal things too, of course, but more specifically, what is that feeling and how are you, creating a space, again, in the communication centric version of kind of the same thing you're saying. How are you creating a space that people feel that they can show up to authentically and feel safe to tell their story? You're saying, how are you creating a space where people feel safe enough to perform at their highest level and again, really reach that authenticity?
Love that you're sharing that, because that to me, that is where we are in the world right now, is how do we actually help each other feel safe enough to express their authentic voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm using voice literally, also metaphorically.
Yeah.
Right. So how do I help you feel safe enough to share your honest viewpoints,
Mm-hmm.
express your voice? How do I help my daughters? How do I help them? Right. To actually tap into who they really are and to feel confident and safe enough to share that with the
Mm-hmm.
world. That is what this is all about.
Yeah.
You,
A real core of CMM is this idea that we shape our social world, and in turn, our social world shape us. And so there's a real focus on seeing yourself. I mean, in the theory world, it'd be considered a social constructionist theory. But what that just means is that you're a participant, and you, again, it gets back to those choices and the way that you act and the way that you make meaning in the stories you tell, that you are actively participating. And again, to me, that gets back to this idea, like, that's so empowering to me and exciting. And I understand it's overwhelming to maybe to some people be like, oh my God, where do I even start? But to me, again, these are all these steps towards that freedom that you talked about right at the beginning. I've before talked about like, oh, it feels so liberating to like have this language. So for you to say freedom, I immediately have a recognition or familiarity about that as well. And so, yeah, it's this, I'm showing up, and that matters how I show up, because it's shaping the social, it's shaping the other people around me, it's shaping their experiences, and also how they're showing up to me matters as well. And so if we can really come together and co-create something meaningful in the way that we're all acknowledging, not just what we're doing on the outside, but also what is going on inside of us as well.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Michael, I so appreciate your time today as we wrap up. Is there anything else you want to say that we didn't get to talk about? Any last words you want to leave us with about polyvagal theory or the play zone?
I mean, I think we really covered, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
And I guess the key takeaway is to really align with your own physiology as much as you can, moment to moment, whatever that means for you. Meet your body where it is. And if you can start integrating that simple practice of the habit of safety, that can really have a pretty big impact on where you are in your physiology. You know, it's not about having to sit and do a 20-minute practice. It's not about having to add more to your already very hectic lifestyle, like most of us have. It can be as simple as just having a level of awareness of how our bodies are continually adapting and shifting based on the environment or the interaction or even the foods that we've just eaten, right? All of that. And then how do we relate to that in a way that just might add a little more internal comfort, a little more sense of grounding and enoughness, so that then we can do what you were just articulating. We can show up in our vast number of roles, at least closer, more aligned with how we would like to show up. And when we fall short, which we will, I fall short, and this is what I do.
Yeah. Yes.
And no harm. I mean, there's less guilt. I know how to come back into enough safety so that I can repair, right? Repair, whatever that is. So to me, that's the key takeaway, is to just recognize and respect that is playing out beneath the surface in yourself and everyone that you're interacting with and everyone that you're watching on TV or the news or any of that. It's all playing out. And by having this perspective, there's a chance, an opportunity to not just get swept away by these reflexive bodily reactions, but to have a chance to maybe interrupt the story that is feeding into more of a threat-oriented response in this world, and maybe realign the physiology to support compassion, to support kindness, benevolence, caring, trust, all of those things that actually would be considered from polyvagal theory's perspective as our default state. Our default state is not to be in threat. It's our default state is to be in homeostasis, which is, from homeostasis can emerge this feeling of safety, which can then allow connection and trust and benevolence and kindness and love and patience and all of those wonderful human attributes that would be coming from our default state.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up. That is actually the default, because a lot of times it can feel like the stress is the default, the pressure is the default. Yeah.
No, great.
Yeah, well, beautiful. Well said. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so glad to have had the chance to meet you and speak with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Michael. At the end of each episode, I like to offer questions to reflect on. This acts as a next turn for us, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the questions I would have you think about are: what is going on with your physiological self right now? What do you need to do to slow down, get quiet enough to pay attention to this? And how might your interactions and relationships change if you show up using what you learned about polyvagal theory today? Like CMM, I think polyvagal theory has a lot of really practical applications that can help us make better social worlds, because it's helping us to relate better to our bodies and to the bodies of the people around us, to our own experiences and the experiences of the people around us. And kind of like we talked about last week with Aminata, holding space for these things. So I'm already excited about how these conversations are working together to create something larger. You're welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, as well as any questions or ideas of your own. I love to be in conversation with you, and you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, and links to all of those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. And another great way to do that is to follow the show wherever you listen, so you never miss an episode. Also, I'd appreciate it if you leave a rating or a review wherever you listen. And most importantly to me, I ask that you share this episode. So maybe add that to the 2 questions I just offered as something to reflect on. Who might this episode be meaningful for in your life? Who do you want to invite into the conversation? I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds. Other initiatives include the Cosmo Activities line, which are educational resources for children of all ages to help children start to think about the role in their social worlds, communication, empathy, and a lot of other great skills that aren't always taught in the classroom. Those activities are available for free at www.cosmoactivities.com. So whether you're an educator, a parent, grandparent, or caregiver in any way, I invite you to go check those out. You can learn more about the CMM Institute, Cosmo Activities, and all the other initiatives at the links that I've provided in the show notes as well. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.